Can everyone hear me? Fine. Members, I guess our guest today needs little introduction. She's had quite a few mentions already, so I'll be reasonably brief. Isobel is a lawyer by profession and had a private practice before entering Parliament as a member for Iceland in 2002 and held key shadow portfolios before becoming Liberal leader in July 2009. Significant point, Isobel is the first woman to lead a major political party in this state, and one of the few in Australia. As well as leading the party currently, she is shadow spokesman for the arts, multicultural affairs and the Independent Commission Against Corruption. I might add that Isobel was the first female president of Rotary in the Hills and is a Paul Harris Fellow, so she's well familiar with the wonderful work this organisation does. It's a great pleasure that I introduce Isobel Redmond, Leader of the Opposition to the South Australian Parliament and Liberal Leader.
Thank you, John, and can I thank you and Barry Harris, President, for the invitation to join you today. And it is a pleasure to be here, especially in the oldest Rotary Club in South Australia. As John mentioned, I am a Paul Harris Fellow. I proudly wear my badge today. I can remember that about 2 o'clock this morning that I was coming to this lunch and I should remember to wear it. I never remember to put the thing on. But I thought I might start, in fact, by talking a bit about how Rotary has actually played quite a significant role in my path to the point that I now am at as the Leader of the Opposition, because Rotary has actually always been, virtually always, part of my life. My father was a Rotarian, and it was through that early exposure to community service that I actually became involved in the sorts of things that led me into politics ultimately. I began life, as many of you may know, I am born and raised in Sydney. For those of you who are familiar with Sydney, and I know at least Stephen Larkin's in the room is familiar with Sydney, because Stephen, if someone should find Stephen went to high school with me on the outskirts of Sydney, and I was born the fourth of 5 children in a typical post-war baby boomer family. My dad had been a member of the second AIF in Tobruk and El Alamein and New Guinea and so on. And luckily for us, he got dengue fever when he got to New Guinea, and that probably is the reason that I'm here now, because he came home from New Guinea fairly early and survived the war. Fourth of 5 children, but living in a very sort of middle class, I suppose you might describe it as working class area. 5-row house built by my father, and with 3 older brothers and sisters and 1 younger. And I was the only one who wanted to pursue a tertiary education. And the youngsters these days cannot comprehend, in fact a lot of parents can't comprehend, but in those days, coming from that background, wanting to study law was a really unusual thing. And indeed my screaming battles with my mother as a 16-year-old were not about short skirts or boys or late nights or alcohol or any of those things. They were about the fact that I wanted to study law. And although my mother was aspirant enough that she wanted me to finish high school and she thought I could become a nurse or a teacher, she certainly thought that law was an unsuitable occupation for a girl. Now, compare that though with my 2 best friends, twins whose parents didn't believe in educating daughters and forced their daughters, who were very bright, to leave school in year 10. And so, I was lucky enough to at least have parents who wanted me to finish school and go on and do something. And in those days, of course, it was pre-Gough-Whitlam's abolition of university fees. And much as I don't like to acknowledge the benefits of any Labor government, and I'll be careful not to be political in this speech, but I do think that the abolition of university fees was one of the great social changes of the last century in this country, and it opened up the possibility of university education for a lot of people who would not otherwise have had it. Sadly for me, I graduated high school just before he did that, and I was therefore unable to go. You know, the cost of fees in those days was $2,500 for 1 year of law school. I was admitted to law school. I was offered a place at Sydney University and at New South Wales University, but I couldn't take that up because my father's income was about $6,500 a year before tax. So the idea of paying $2,500 for a daughter to go to university and then have to pay the textbooks and keep it all that was just not on the agenda. And so I actually went to work in the Crown Solicitor's office. Began there on the 14th of February 1972. I'm aware of that date simply because, apart from the obvious connection to the date we got to decimal currency, but next year on the 14th of February next year in February 2012 will be 40 years since I began work in the Crown Solicitor's office, and that's the day we're returning to Parliament next year, so I have to look at it recently. So I came from this family though that had a long history and a strong history of being involved in community service. My mum was a full-time mum, and my mother at one stage was working on 5 different school canteens for all the different schools for various reasons. And my dad was in Rotary. And so some of my early memories and some of my great times with my dad were going to father and daughter nights. Now this is back in the days before Rotary became a club for old men and their fathers. This was back in the days when Rotary clubs had a lot of younger families in them. And it was a regular thing that there were father and son nights and father and daughter nights. And so, you know, I have fond memories of going to Rotary clubs as quite a young person. And one of the things that my father's Rotary club used to do was to take local disabled children out on a picnic once a year. And so from a very young age, I was involved in that activity with that Rotary club because in order to entertain those young disabled children, because this was in the days before there was any respite care formally provided by governments or any other organisations, most of the families who had disabled children at home had to manage them at home permanently by themselves. And so once a year the Rotary Club would take these kids and take them on a picnic down into the National Park, and we would entertain them. And as a youngster I was more able to communicate with these young people than perhaps my dad and my mum. And so every year that was something that I did as a matter of course. And through that and through involvement in the church, where I became a Sunday school teacher at the age of 11, and I began becoming quite involved in that sort of area and visiting nursing homes. And those are the things that have stayed with me through all the years of my career. So having finished high school, gone off to university part-time, studying at night, what's called the Barristers Admissions Board. You may recall last year that the government decided they'd make a bit out of the fact that they suddenly, I don't know why, I've never hidden it, they suddenly became aware that I don't have a law degree. And the Attorney General tweeted right away that this was probably not a good path to go down, since they had appointed themselves people to the district court bench who don't have law degrees, because it was just an alternative way of doing law in those days. And so I studied law part-time at night and was admitted in June 1977. And in the meantime, of course, I had met an American guy, and we married a couple of months after my admission. So those California visitors, I've not only been to the States, I've been to North Dakota. And not many people in America have been to North Dakota. And we decided to move to Adelaide. And we did that because we literally, having married an American, we could have gone to America. I had a mother who'd been born in Scotland. We could have gone to Europe. We instantly said Australia was by far the best place to be, and by far the best place to have a future and a family. And then we looked at each state, and we actually, having no family or friends here, decided that South Australia was the very best place of all the states. And I still believe that, and I've never regretted making that move now 33 years ago to come to South Australia and to make a future in this state, because I still believe it is the very best place in the world. So having come here, of course, I then began working and worked for some time as a lawyer, but had family, had 3 children who are now aged 30, 28 and 25, but they were born in the Stirling Hospital. And when my first child was 1 year old, I actually decided I wasn't going to work, obviously, but I would seek election to local council, and so I was elected to the then Stirling Local Council, and I became the deputy chair of that. Money never seemed to have followed me. This was in the days when you got no allowance whatsoever for being on local council, and then we actually voted against the introduction of an allowance, but it was introduced anyway, and my council elected to have the minimum you could have, which was $300 a year. I was the deputy chair, now been called the deputy mayor, but I got $500 a year for my 40 hours a week or so that I was bringing to local council. And so I had a fairly busy time. I had one child onto council, then I had another baby, and can I say, I went on to council and then had this baby, and Stirling Council did not bat an eyelid at me bringing along a newborn baby to council meetings and feeding it, changing it, all those things, continuing to be participating in the council meeting. And indeed, there's another young mother came along, so we're in the local paper as being the youngsters who come along, brought our babies along into the council meetings. And I thought that went really well until one night I was sitting there having successfully fed my newborn son. He's now 6'1" and a lawyer. But I fed my newborn baby and I changed it and I put him back in the pusher and he'd gone back to sleep. And a note came from the other mother on the other side of the chamber saying, check out the front of his shirt, the right side. And I had baby poo all down my shirt. So I did have a bit of fun, but by the time I got to the point where I was working, I started working part-time in a local legal practice, and I had 2 babies. In fact, the second one, that same baby, that newborn, I actually had him at the end of a long day of work. I was at work until 5:10, at which point I was having contractions. I need to go home now. I got to the hospital at 6 o'clock and I produced the baby at 7:37. So I was back at work 2 weeks later, would you believe? And in the then Stirling court, I came in with my baby, and the guy who employed me, who didn't have any children of his own, thought, oh, well, if you can do it once, you can do it all the time. So I was back at work regularly. But when I then was pregnant with the third one, and he closed that practice, I decided that 3 babies, preschoolers, and a job as well as being on council was probably a bit much even for me, and so I stepped back from that. But that involvement in local council had led me into a range of other things, and I became involved in a whole series of things around the district, including the Stirling District Hospital, a hospital I continued to serve on until just after I became leader when I had to give it away. And I, through those things, became very involved in my community. And indeed, it was through the Stirling District Hospital, and I was up for a re-election after about 15 years or something like that. There was an election, there was actually a contest because it was a good hospital board, people wanted to get onto it, and I had to present myself, and I did, and I was re-elected, and at the end of the night, the chap who did the counting of the votes came over and said, you got a perfect score. Everyone in the room voted for you. Have you ever thought about going into politics? And until that moment, the idea had never crossed my mind. So I'm not someone who actually spent my life planning to get to the position I'm now in. I didn't even expect to go into politics. I literally, until that moment, had never thought about a political career at all. But I began to contemplate the fact that I'd achieved what I wanted to achieve as a lawyer. My family was growing up and being a little less time-consuming. I was still passionate about serving my community, and I really thought that maybe I could make a contribution in that way. My legal background might be useful, but I could make a contribution. And of course, David Watton, who many of you would know, was the member for Hyson, and in fact someone here said they're good friends of David's, a lovely man, and he was a very good local member. There was no way I was ever going to run against David to become the member for Hyson, but I figured that he'd already been here for 20 plus years, so he wasn't going to be in Parliament forever. And if I positioned myself carefully, I might be able to become the member following him. Of course, that came to pass. But in the meantime, I had also joined Rotary. Now, as John said in the introduction, I was the first female in Rotary up in the hills, and that was an interesting process because I don't know what things are like in this club, but certainly my club of Stirling these days, if someone looks like a likely prospect, they're practically chained into the room on their first visit and signed up, whereas being the first female was quite contentious, and it took 5 months of attending weekly meetings with the club before they decided that they would move to have me admitted. David Lloyd, some of you may know, from from Morialta Club, was a member of Stirling at that stage, and he actually undertook the brave task of moving my admission as the first female member. There were men in the club who threatened to leave should I become a member. And the interesting thing is that none of them did leave. They all seemed to find it very threatening, but no one left. And, you know, on a number of occasions through my various parts of my career, I've been the first or the second female. I was the first female in a number of cases. I was the second female elected to local council in Stirling. I was the first female on the Road Safety Advisory Council, and I was dear to Sir Eric's heart. I was the first female member of that, and I was the only female for about the first 9 years in that. And all the time I've had this sort of mental debate with myself. Do I accept this because I know that a lot of the time I was being offered the position because I was a female, and people felt they wanted to at least have a token female. And I generally came down on the side of saying, yes, I should take the appointment, but I should then be the best member that I can be it of Rotary or the Road Safety Advisory Council or the South Australian Ambulance Board or the local hospital board or whatever it might be. My job was not to simply be the token female, but to become a good member of whatever it was, and to show that it didn't matter that I was a female, but I could still be a good Rotarian, for instance. In fact, I was telling the guys at the head table here that within 2 months of becoming a member of Rotary, I was made Counsellor for the outgoing International Exchange student, Director of International. I remained Director of International for the next 3 years. I then became Club Director and then President, and in the meantime I spent 4 years of producing the weekly bulletin out of my legal office and being the Program Director and then sometimes Sergeant. And so I actually did put in a bit of effort as a Rotarian, and indeed I still have ambitions in Rotary. I still, after this career is finished, I'd like to return to Rotary and perhaps lead a GSE team at some stage. I think the GSE teams have a lot to recommend them. But, so, you know, Rotary, in that sense, provided me with one of the many pathways, because it provided me with a lot of exposure to a lot of other people in my own area, but across South Australia in all the things that we did. And, you know, I can still remember going to my President-elect training seminar, when they said being President of the club has to be the #1 priority, and I said, well, certainly after my 3 children, my husband, my business, all these other things that I have to do, it will be my #1 priority. And they were still at that stage debating about having female members, and I've got to tell you, I was the only one in the room of training presidents-elect who laughed when they told the story of a particular club in South Australia where they still banned women. One of the gentlemen in the club decided that he'd been born into the wrong gender, and he decided to change. And I thought it was hysterically funny that this club was so troubled by one of its own members turning up in dresses and becoming more buxom as the weeks wore on. They didn't seem to think it was as funny as I did. So anyway, so there I was, placing myself in a position where I might be able to seek election to the Parliament, and in due course, of course, David Watton did decide that he would stand down, and I was going to seek pre-selection. I was by no means the only one. It's one of those seats, a bit like some of the seats around the state at the moment, where people are lining up and there's a Melbourne Cup field of candidates, if you'll pardon the current analogy. So I was looking to seek it, and I'm an incredibly lucky person. When I was going to set up my legal practice, for instance, we'd been to the bank about asking to borrow $25,000, a very meagre amount, to set up my own legal practice in Stirling, because I decided that I've been working for the big firms downtown and I really didn't like the way they were managed by money and 6-minute time units and so on, and I really felt there was a better way to practice law. I was going to set up my own practice, and we'd been to the bank and said about borrowing $25,000. We didn't even buy the scratchy, but between Christmas and New Year we won a $1 scratchy for $25,000. Now that will give you some idea of how lucky I am. And yes, I did come out ahead yesterday. So on my very first attempt at pre-selection, and it ended up, there were 3 guys and me, and they would draw straws for this particular process, and I got the last position, so they all spoke before me. And as it happens, I was sitting upstairs, they keep you in isolation and you have to go down and they tell you you can speak for 5 minutes and then we'll have questions for 5 minutes. And I was sitting upstairs and I happened to glance at a little note that I'd made when Mark Brindle, as the Minister for Water at the time, given a speech up at Winky in the Riverland. Obscure thing, and I don't know why I had it inside my folder, but there was a little sticky post-it note. I happened to have read that and went down, made my speech, and one of the questions thrown at me by someone who was definitely trying to thwart my ambitions was about the very topic that was on this paper, and I was able to answer this question as though it was a friendly question being fired at me. And so it all fell into place. I was actually pre-selected on my very first attempt at the first round of the pre-selection. I didn't think anything of it. They tell me now that people like Alexander Downer had 4 or 5 attempts, and Anna Vanstone had 4 or 5 attempts. I got pre-selected on my first attempt in the first round, and then indeed elected on my first attempt at being elected. And so in that sense, I've never looked back. But I do always remind people, I met Michael Parkinson not long ago. The best thing about this job is you get to meet the most amazing people. I'm still blown away by the fact that Andy Thomas came and introduced himself to me yesterday. But I met Michael Parkinson, and I remember seeing an interview that he did of a guy called John Prescott, who was the Deputy Prime Minister to Tony Blair in the UK. And John Prescott expressed it very well when he explained that he actually, as I do, feels sorry for those people who, at the age of 18 or 20 or whatever, decide that they're going into politics and they're going to be the Premier of the state or they're going to be the Prime Minister, because they don't enjoy the journey along the way. They actually are so focused on obtaining that ephemeral prize, which is really not much of a prize at all when you get there. They are actually focused on that to the exclusion of enjoying the journey, whereas he took the view, and it's a view that I share, and that is that I've just taken whatever opportunities have come my way in life and grabbed them with both hands, because at the end of the day, I don't want to get to my deathbed and think, gee, I wonder what if. I want to get there and know that I at least had a crack, and that I've tried the best that I can do. And my philosophy, therefore, is not that I desperately want to be the Premier. What I want is better government for this state. And I've always taken the view that it's not appropriate for me to sit back and say, well, I want better government, and complain about the government that's there, if I'm not prepared to get up and try to do better myself. And that's what motivates me in the job, rather than trying to be the first female Premier of the state. And, this state, of course, most of you in Californians mightn't be aware, but this state was the 4th place in the world to give women the right to vote. We were slightly behind New Zealand and the Isle of Man's Tynewald and one other. But we were the very first place in the world to give women the right to stand for Parliament, 1894. It only took us from then until 1959 to get one elected, a Liberal. And so we've had a good record in terms of getting women there eventually. By the time I entered the Parliament, 1/3 of people in the Parliament were women. But I've also always taken the view that I'm not in favour of affirmative action. I actually am famous for getting up in our Parliament regularly. Whenever this Parliament passes a bill and it introduces some sort of new board or committee, the legislation invariably says there'll be a board of X number of people, at least one of whom shall be a female. Every time that's in the bill, I get up and make the Isobel speech, which Hansard are quite used to now. And the Isobel speech is basically to say, look, we are in the 21st century. The job to be done here is not a matter of gender, and therefore we should be choosing people purely on merit. And until we are, we do not have equality. Because I believe that there's a real sting in the tail in affirmative action, in that young men who are passed over for jobs because they've got to have a female have every right to be aggrieved as females had the right to be in days gone by. So I actually believe that we need to be far more equal in the way we manage all those things. So I won't keep going much longer. Having got into Parliament, of course, there's some weird things that happen when you're in Parliament. And media, most people are terrified of the media. I sat next to a guy yesterday at the Morpheville, and as soon as he realised who was sitting beside me, he said, the media aren't coming to find you, are they? I said, no. He said, because he was going to hide if they were actually going to come in and film me, because he didn't want to be seen beside me on the telly. And, I hate having my photo taken. You can't imagine what this job's like for someone who hates having a photo taken. I've been known to cut myself out of the family portrait before sending it on. Having a portrait on every billboard across the state, every stable pole across the state, is a bizarre way to live your life. I drive like this during election times. I don't want to be seen, but I just decided you've just got to get over it and get over yourself and get on with getting your message out. But you know, the media, my first experience in the media, when I was first elected, I went for a tour of the Parliament House, and we were coming down the front steps. Now, if you take yourselves back to 2002, there was a very fine balance. Peter Lewis hadn't given his decision yet as to whether we were going to have a Liberal government or a Labor government. The media were camped out on the front steps. We'd had the tour inside, and what we'd been shown was where's the canteen and where's the ladies' toilets and the boys' toilets and all that sort of thing. When we left, as we were going down the front steps, because we didn't have passes to get out the back, so we had to go out the front, went out the front, there's the media, someone recognised Vicky Chapman, who was elected in the same group, came rushing over. Once one camera comes, they all came over, and there we were, being filmed, crossing the road. That night, we were on the news as though we were part of some great negotiation about whether Peter Lewis was going to give Liberal or Labor government, and all we found out was where the toilets were. So, you know, you can tell that not everything you see on television is necessarily, just because you see a picture of it, the truth. But it is the most interesting job in the world. I certainly hope for South Australia that we will see a return of South Australia's greatness. When I was growing up, South Australia was the third in the ranking of the states. New South Wales and Victoria certainly were bigger. But we were third in those days, and I have an aspiration that we should get back to that level. We should get back to being third. We still have a great manufacturing sector. We have a great future in front of us with the defence industry and the resources and mining industry. We have a fabulous population. I think we have the very best place in the world still, and I think we need to get rid of the cringe factor that so often comes from the eastern states. The cities of Sydney and Melbourne are too big. They've got problems because of their size. We are an ideal-sized city, and I think we need to crow about it and be proud of the fact that this is the very best place in the world to live. And I look forward to hopefully leading this state in 2 years, 4 months and 15 days or so. Thank you.
Well, thank you, members. I believe that was a most illuminating speech and quite refreshing to hear someone talk about their background and how they've worked their way up in public life the way Isobel has. Now, we have time for about 5 minutes of questions, and then I believe Isobel's going to draw a raffle. Is that right, Frank? That's right. Writing orders. So, any questions?
Isobel, just wondering, what do you find to be the hardest part of your position?
I would say keeping your temper. It sometimes can be frustrating when you believe you've got a good message to get out and you don't control the media, and the public say, you know, why aren't you getting that message out? But you don't control what's going to be on the television news and what's going to be on talkback radio and what's going to be in the newspapers. And so sometimes we'll have, for instance, given a very good story to a newspaper and we don't even get a mention in it. So that's extremely frustrating. And look, there are a lot of frustrations about bits and pieces of the job, and I think the trick is you have to keep your eye on the big picture and make sure that that's where you focus, that we need to recognise that we want a better South Australia, and I've got to focus on getting there for the sake of South Australia in the 2.5 years that we've got to run till the election.
Thanks, Isobel, for that wonderful insight into you and where you come from. I have an observation that one of the endearing things about South Australia against other states we have lived in most is that above politics, leaders of the state tend to get together for the common good. I also have the observation for the last 12 or so years that due to ego or media or both, that seems to have been driven apart. Given that you and Jay once shared offices in the legal profession, do you think that we're seeing the reintroduction of some above politics, greater good type dialogue that may make our state even greater?
Thanks, Peter, for the question, and I trust everyone heard it. For those of you who aren't aware, Jay Weatherall, the new Premier, and I did share offices. We both worked at a firm called Duncan and Hannon, far left Labor legal firm. They didn't know I was a member of the Liberal Party. I was the first person they'd ever employed who came through an employment agency. And so Jay was in-house counsel and I was their most senior employed solicitor, and so we actually have a good working relationship, and because this is a Rotary Club I won't go into the negative side of anything, but certainly a couple of weeks ago it came as a great surprise to the media when they found out I don't much for Mike Rann. And the funny thing was, I mean, I'd spoken at the Police Association conference on that day, and the Premier had a huge slap at me, accusing me of being inclined to let out Bevan Spencer Lyon and various other dreadful murderers, which was never on the agenda. I went out to answer that in the media afterwards, and instead of that, Mike Smithson started asking me about Mike Rann, and I politely but honestly gave a response, and that was all we went to dinner to TV that night. And the funny thing was that Mike Rann repeated his spray both at that conference and in the Parliament later that day, word for word, and none of it got to air because they chose to put on that. But with Jay and I, for instance, had a meeting in his office last week, so we do have a much better personal relationship, and we have always got along well. We were opposite each other. In fact, I always say we were probably the only Premier and Leader of the Opposition in any Parliament anywhere to give each other a peck on the cheek before going in to be sworn in as members of Parliament in the first place, because we come from, we both worked in that firm. I left and set up my practice, he left and set up his practice, and then we were elected on the same day, and indeed I'm mentioned in his maiden speech. So there is the possibility of a better dialogue, but bear in mind that this is an adversarial system, and the Speaker is appointed by the government, and there is a certain frustration on the part of oppositions generally when you ask questions in question time and you don't get answers. And also bear in mind that the media love the theatre of question time. The rest of the time in the Parliament, if you go in there to visit, you'll see that we're very quiet, and mostly there is a fair bit of cooperation, and 98% of bills go through and get just a good debate. The fact is that the media love that theatre, and when I first was elected, and I was just gobsmacked by the behaviour in question time, and I had sat there and thought, oh, I'm not going to do this. We were written up as a lazy, disinterested opposition. And so there is a certain expectation on the part of the media that we will behave in a very robust way. Certainly Jay indicated to me in our meeting last week that he would like to change that, and certainly I indicated to Jay that he's never been in opposition.
That's Isobel, a straight shooter. Well done. Does anyone else? We've only got time for one more question.
Well, because my philosophy is basically liberal, in as much as I believe in the freedom of the individual. And it's probably the area where Jay and I, although we have a good personal relationship, philosophically, Jay is quite a left-wing person in the sense that he wants to have big bureaucracies manage things. So when he was in disability, he closed Julia Farr, defunded Intellectual Disability Services Council, Brain Injury Network, and all those things on the basis that they're done by big bureaucracy. My view is that I want small government that gets out of the way and lets communities get on with running their own lives and put as much money as possible out into the community and into NGOs and so on. And so there's that sort of philosophy that I actually think that the better way to live life is to allow every individual to have their own aspirations, to pursue their own dreams, or whether that's having their own home or building their business or raising their families or whatever it is. I much prefer the sort of individual approach, and I'd have to be classified as a pretty small L liberal. The second reason is that, and it's a fundamental reason for me, the Liberal Constitution actually guarantees me the right to disagree with the party room. Whereas the Labor Party actually has a requirement, once the caucus, which is what they call their party room, once the caucus makes its decision, you are bound by that decision. In the Liberal Party, on a weekly basis, without fail, there are situations where a decision is taken by the party room that someone will say, I reserve my right, and it's recorded in the minute book, and what they mean is that they're reserving the right guaranteed to them under the Constitution to disagree with the party room and to vote according to their conscience.
Well, thank you very much, Isobel. We've all looked forward to having you here for so long, and it's great that you could grace us with your presence today. We've had a wonderful attendance. Would you all rise, members, and thank Isobel Redmond